of time now. We couldn't begin in a better way than with our first presenter. Dr. Francis Collins is the director of the National Institutes of Health. What we know today of the relationship between genes and disease is in no small part due to the results of the path-breaking research of Dr. Collins. Dr. Collins is the former director of the National Human Genome Research Institute. He led the Human Genome Project, pioneering work that revolutionized our understanding of the building blocks of life. A member of the Institutes of Health and the National Academy of Sciences, Dr. Collins is a recipient of the Presidential Medal of Freedom and the National Medal of Science, the highest honors bestowed on scientists by the United States government. Dr. Collins was one of the first people, indeed maybe the first person I met with after my appointment as chair. It is a pleasure to have you with us today. We look forward to hearing your views. Welcome, Francis.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Gutman, Dr. Wagner, distinguished members of this council. It's a real pleasure to have a chance to address you at the beginning of what I think is going to be a really interesting day, and I congratulate you for identifying this pair of potential topics, genetics and neuroimaging, and the ethical consequences that are coming out of rapid advances in this field as an area that is ripe for this kind of deliberation. And I wish you well in trying to figure out exactly which parts of this matrix you might decide would be most appropriate for a study and a report. Before I get into that, though, I also want to say how much I appreciate the work that you're doing on international human subjects issues. Obviously, an area of enormous interest at NIH, and especially in the wake of the revelations about the studies in Guatemala on individuals who were infected intentionally with various pathogens, often without their knowledge. While that was 60 years ago, it's highly appropriate to have a close look now at the circumstances internationally to be certain that we have norms in place. So God willing and the government don't shut down, I will be on a plane tomorrow at 5:30 on the way to South Africa, and I will spend the next 9 days there as part of the initiation of two major projects in sub-Saharan Africa. One of them called Human Health and Heredity in Africa, or H3 Africa, which aims to look at both environmental and genetic contributions to common diseases in Africa, both communicable and non-communicable. And another called the Medical Education Partnership Initiative, where we seek to provide capacity building opportunities to African universities, trying to provide them the opportunity to be capable of doing much more research without having so much in the way of having this imposed upon them. And of course, for all of that to be successful, certainly human subjects issues are going to be critical. So I urge you to do everything you can to investigate that, as I know you will, and look forward very much to seeing the outcome of those deliberations. You have an amazing lineup of presenters for today. And so I think my task is to sort of whet your appetite and maybe provide a little bit of an appetizer, and then all kinds of interesting entrees will be served up over the course of today. And I guess you get to have the dessert when you get everybody around the table together and try to pin them down as to what exactly would make the most sense. I apologize because of my own ridiculous schedule today that I won't be able to come back for that discussion at the end of the afternoon, but I certainly will be interested in hearing the outcome. And may I say, we are delighted to have Val Bonham as your executive secretary, somebody that we are proud of having nurtured and encouraged and hopefully mentored a bit during her time at NIH.
You don't get full credit, but you do get part credit.
We'll take whatever we can get. So I'm going to try to go through a little bit of an overview about what NIH has been doing in the area of bioethics, familiar to many of you, but just a quick survey of that, and then dig into the topics, genetics and neuroimaging. I'll spend most of my time on genetics because I think that is an area where I have more familiarity, although as the NIH director of everything we're supposed to be doing in this amazing institution, I've also gotten very interested in the topics that will come up in terms of neuroimaging, and I'll say a little bit about those too. So NIH has this mission statement, which is science in pursuit of fundamental knowledge about the nature and behavior of living systems and the application of that knowledge to extend healthy life. So this is basic and clinical. About 60% of our budget is in basic science, about 40% is in clinical applications. And I think it's immediately obvious that there are ethical consequences, particularly the clinical applications. And so NIH has been in the area of bioethics for some time. In a recent survey about exactly what kind of budgetary investments we make in bioethics, approximately $50 million per year is spent by the institutes and centers, of which there are 27, in bioethics research. The largest of those is the program in the Genome Institute, the ELSI program, familiar to many of you, in which I had the privilege of overseeing for some 17 years. And that is currently budgeted out at about $18 million per year. During the period of the ERA funding, there was a special opportunity with challenge grants to fund additional bioethics grants. 21 of them were supported in a very hotly competitive arena. Some of those actually were supported by the director's office and many of them by the institutes. And out of that, although those are just 2-year grants, and as you know, that has provided some stresses for the system because science doesn't generally operate on 2-year cycles, nor does bioethics. Nonetheless, this was an opportunity to support some very interesting research. And then in the budget that we were given in FY10, there's a $5 million allocation to the Office of the Director. That is being used to support bioethics grants from the institutes who come to the OD and ask for shared support if they have something that seems to fit the bioethics research and training agenda. A bioethics task force has been in operation since May of 2009 and was put in place to review in a more detailed way what NIH has been doing and to develop a strategic plan. One of your members is a co-chair of that task force, Christine Grady. In addition, the other co-chairs are Amy Patterson, now the director of our Office of Science Policy, and Griff Rogers, who's the director of the Diabetes Institute. A number of other institute directors sit on this task force, and it involves representation from no less than 25 of the institutes and centers. They have gone through a first phase, and it has been useful to look at what their results have been in terms of where the investments are. But the second phase is going to be more about the development of a strategic plan, which is now underway. The near-term priorities have certainly emphasized the importance for mission-related bioethics initiatives and training initiatives, but the longer-term goal is to try to do more to integrate bioethics into the full spectrum of biomedical research, not having this as a separate discipline, but one that is fully connected with what is going on in the laboratories and the clinics. And there is a process as part of this strategic planning effort to seek public input in diverse forums. So this will be an important action for NIH going forward. Of course, I will now have to mention something about the ELSI program because I think that has been such a major investment in bioethics, and it also is familiar territory from my own background. Of course, in 2001, just about exactly 10 years ago, we saw these publications on the draft sequence of the human genome. And in that 10th anniversary, just a week ago, Nature published this follow-up special issue, and very much putting forward a view of what we've learned in those 10 years and where we're going. I think the general sense is that genomics has utterly revolutionized what's going on in the laboratory. Graduate students can't imagine how you did anything in human biology without access to the genome sequence and many other databases and technologies. But its implications for the clinic are really only just beginning, and a lot of what was being talked about in this issue of Nature related to that. You can see the consequences in terms of discoveries of the causes of disease, in terms of the molecular basis of conditions that have a Mendelian cause. If you see the way this builds up over the course of the last 30 years, it is clear, well, 23 anyway, it is clear that there's a long list of successes here, now reaching almost 4,000 conditions for which we have a molecular explanation. Most of those are rare diseases, but if it's your family, it doesn't matter so much if it's rare, you were hoping for answers. Today is actually Rare Disease Day, February 28th. We're having a whole symposium at NIH about Rare Disease Day, and it's one of the reasons I have to run back there to take part in that. And I think there's a lot of excitement in the rare disease arena that this kind of research is leading to insights and ultimately to potential interventions for diseases that traditionally have not received much attention. Not only rare diseases, but common diseases are having a lot of molecular insights provided by genomic approaches. This is a diagram of the human karyotype, and each one of those colored circles represents a well-validated variant in the genome, in the human population, that's associated with risk of a common disease. So on that chart, which looks rather daunting, and it is, are about 1,000 of those related to risk factors for diabetes, for heart disease, for the common cancers, for hypertension, for asthma, you name it. Most common diseases for which people have been able to assemble thousands of affected and unaffected individuals have been subjected to this genome-wide association approach, and discoveries have been made about pathways that must be involved in disease. While these variants are, for the most part, quite modest in their contribution to disease risk, and that has greatly limited the ability to use this information for prevention in terms of trying to identify individual risks for disease, still these are pointing to pathways that are of extreme interest in terms of identifying the molecular causes of disease and pointing towards new ideas for therapeutic interventions. And this is one of the motivations, in fact, why at NIH we are proposing the formation by next October of a National Center for Advancing Translational Sciences to try to take advantage of this deluge of discoveries about rare and common diseases. On top of that, the technology for DNA sequencing has been advancing at a breathtaking pace. This curve shows you in the diamonds there in the orange line what's happened to the cost per megabase, that is 1 million base pairs, of DNA sequence over the course of the last 10 years. That's a log scale over there. You will see the yellow line is what you would get from Moore's Law, which we used to think was the gold standard for technologies advancing at a really breathtaking pace. Moore's Law, of course, for computer capabilities. You can see that DNA sequencing is actually outstripping Moore's Law substantially. And this shows no sign of coming to an end. And so now much of the hand-wringing is not about how to generate the sequence, it's how to store it and how to analyze it, which has become really quite a problem. Biologists used to be considered by the computational experts as not having any really interesting problems. Not anymore. We are quickly arising at the top of the list here in terms of size of data sets and complexity of analysis. And this leads to the potential in the next 3 to 5 years of individual genome sequencing getting into the range of affordability as part of the standard of medical care if we decide that that's a good thing. The cost may well be in the $1,000 range within 5 years. Right now, it's about $8,000 roughly to do a whole genome sequence. That has already led to some interesting examples where this application has shed light on diseases that were previously mysterious. And the Milwaukee Sentinel has a front page story today about Nick that I've been getting to know a bit, who's 6 years old, and had a very mysterious condition, severe inflammatory bowel disease, Crohn's disease, but starting extremely early, just before his 2nd birthday, with intestinal fistulas, unable to take solid food, 100+ surgeries, and no diagnosis, no understanding of what was going on. So they sequenced, in this case, not his entire genome, but the exome, that is the protein coding parts of the genomes, and found a mutation in a gene called XIAP on the X chromosome. This had previously been linked to a blood disorder, and in those patients who didn't happen to have the intestinal problems, bone marrow transplant had been curative. And so, recognizing it was a considerable risk, this resulted in a stem cell transplant in Nick from a healthy donor back last summer. Today, he is eating solid food and doing well and recovering quite nicely, the indications being that the transplant has both affected his blood problems, which were actually present but not the majority of the attention, and his intestinal problems. So you might say in this case, genome sequencing leading to a diagnosis, leading to an intervention, which may very well have been life-saving. And increasingly, one sees more examples of this sort coming up. I might especially mention that's true in cancer, where the ability to diagnose the specific mutations present in a tumor are allowing, in some instances, the choice of therapy in a way that is targeted specifically to what that tumor would be most likely to respond to. Of course, this does raise issues about ethical, legal, and social implications, and that has been the reason the ELSI program, I think, has been a flagship of trying to anticipate those issues. This paper, which now looks a little dated from 8 years ago, was the paper that we published at the time the Human Genome Project essentially was completed by the finishing of the human genome sequence and all of the other original goals. And this fanciful house here, which is intended to look a little bit like Falling Water, was figure 1 in that article. And you will see there were 3 levels: genomics to biology, health, and society. And then there were 6 cross-cutting areas that held it all together, and ELSI being an important part of that, touching on all of those floors. That's now been updated as of a week ago by this paper, Charting a Course for Genomic Medicine Going Forward, by Eric Green and colleagues. And in that is also a description of where this group felt would be, based upon much public consultation, areas of exceptional need as far as ethical, legal, and social issues. Those would be in genomics research, in genomic medicine, legal and public policy circumstances, and broader societal issues. And this might be a useful document to have a look at as part of your deliberations. So that has all been an important part of the program. ELSI was founded in part because of the very difficult history that connects genetics and medicine, and particularly the eugenics effort, which was not, as many people in the public assume, something that arose out of Nazi Germany, but really arose primarily in the United States with the work of Charles Davenport and others, the science of improvement of the human race by better breeding, something that all now causes us to cringe. ELSI was established as an integral part of the Genome Project in 1990. It is about 3 to 5% of the annual budget of the Genome Project, remains vigorously active, and one of the major investments by ELSI now is in these centers of excellence in ELSI research, 6 of them that you see listed here, which involve interdisciplinary effort by multiple investigators focused on specific themes. Now let me turn to where I could sort of imagine you might be wanting to think about specific areas of interest. And I will focus particularly on genetics, but say something about neuroimaging in a bit. First of all, although it may seem like a tired topic, and I'm not sure whether it is an appropriate one for this body to wrestle with, let's be clear. Genetic discrimination, while we've made great headway, is not something that's completely over. The great headway could be pointed particularly to the signing of the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, GINA, in May of 2008. That took some 12 years of effort, going back and forth with many examples where we thought progress was being made, only to find that something else got in the way, but was ultimately signed into law. Now, what GINA does is to make it illegal to use predictive genetic information in health insurance decision-making or in the workplace. And those are good, but let me just say, by way of why this is still on the list, those are not the only areas where genetic discrimination could potentially rear its head. So, for instance, life insurance is not covered by GINA. Now, one might say that's okay, because adverse selection could be a real issue if you knew you were at high risk of a disease and the insurance company didn't, and you bought a $20 million policy. That would be quite destabilizing for the whole enterprise. But should there be some floor, some basic policy level of life insurance for which genetic questions are off the table, certainly that's worth asking about, and some countries have started to deal with that. I think in the US, because it was such a tough fight to get GINA passed, people are still kind of breathing easily that got done, and a little reluctant to plunge into some of these other areas. Long-term care insurance, disability insurance. Think about the whole issue of Alzheimer's risk testing. If you test positive as being homozygous for ApoE4, your risk of getting Alzheimer's disease by the time you're 80 is enormous. Should you be able to get the same kind of long-term care insurance as anybody else, or is the company allowed to ask whether you've done that and what the results were? Educational opportunities have been worried about. I'm not aware that there has been a lot of activity in this area, but would there be circumstances where somebody at risk, for instance, of Huntington's disease would be denied the opportunity to undergo expensive long-term professional training because of a limited expectation of their career duration? Military service likewise. And even things like court decisions about child custody, could that be brought to bear? And there have been a few cases where that has happened, where somebody is judged to be somewhat less appropriate as a parent because of their future risks of illness based upon some genetic test result. So there are unresolved risks there. A second area, which I know you'll be talking about this afternoon, and which is a hot topic in every conversation about every genetic research protocol that I'm involved in, is what are you going to do with this vast amount of data that's now possible to collect as far as dealing with findings that you didn't expect? And do you tell patients or do you not? and the obvious cases come to light immediately in those conversations. Okay, you're doing whole genome sequencing or even whole exome sequencing, and your task is to look at people with diabetes, which is the research project in my lab right now, but you encounter a BRCA1 mutation in a woman who's still in her 20s. Are you obligated to share that information? And obviously that's a tough question. A lot of it depends upon where you set your threshold for things that are truly actionable and who decides what's actionable. I think in the research arena, this has led to a lot of interesting discussions. There's a nice discussion about this in Science actually just 2 weeks ago that begins with a case and goes on to the general discussion about what would you do when you find these tough decisions over what information to give back. And you will have this afternoon a presentation from Susan Wolf, who I have borrowed this particular algorithm from a paper that I think was in your packet in the Journal of Law, Medicine, and Ethics that had a very distinguished lineup of authors who are themselves major leaders in bioethics. And this suggests, I think, a reasonable pathway if you do it prospectively, because this starts with the consent form process and the opportunity to discuss with participants in research that this might happen, and that is the ideal. I guess the thing that I would lay out there as not necessarily as well dealt with, and I'll be interested to hear what Susan Wolf is able to share with you, is how much have we gone down the road when it's not a research project, when it's part of the standard care of medicine. If the $1,000 genome results in complete genome sequencing in millions of people in the next 10 years, there's going to be an uncountable almost number of unexpected findings of uncertain significance that are not part of anybody's informed consent IRB approved process. How should that be dealt with? What norms ought to be anticipated in a circumstance where you haven't had the luxury of a prior conversation about what that individual would like you to do with the information? That's going to be, I think, an interesting conversation. I will actually say, of all the things I'm going to put in front of you, this is the one that I think is probably most ripe for investigation and where I'm not aware that other bodies have been planning to delve into it at the level that needs to be, and that is forensic applications of DNA analysis. Obviously, going back some 20 years, the ability to use DNA analysis to identify perpetrators by DNA matching is an area that got a lot of attention and has now become standard in forensics. But it is expanding rapidly with the ability now to determine large amounts of genetic information and to be able to use that in ways that were not anticipated, I think, 10 or 20 years ago. So for instance, the whole issue of surreptitious collection, which is certainly increasingly possible with a discarded cigarette or even a glass of wine left at the table after the individual has departed the restaurant. This is, in many cases, documented as a means by which law enforcement is making a match. Is there, in fact, some limit that should be placed upon this? Are we comfortable with that? Obviously, if it's for the identification of somebody who's committed a heinous act, then society may be well served by the ability to catch the perpetrator. But if this is being done in a way where the evidence is much less compelling, or if it's not even been done for criminal purposes, but rather to sort of check out the DNA of somebody who's running for public office, which is entirely possible in the coming future, then you have a whole other set of issues in terms of invasions of privacy. And I don't think this has been appropriately mined for the potential that exists there, because it's not only the surreptitious collection for doing DNA matching, as one might want to do in a criminal case, it also may be done for the purposes of making predictions about that individual's future. So for instance, if somebody's running for president, would you like to know what is the ApoE4 genotype for that individual so that you could make some guesses about whether you want to count on an 8-year successful presidency in somebody who's probably already in their 50s or 60s. Tracking through relatives with the ability now to be able, with increasing amounts of DNA information, to make a very careful and accurate prediction down to the second and third degree level of relatedness. Then with DNA databases that are available in forensic situations, you're increasingly going to have the chance of bumping into a circumstance where you don't have a match, but you know that the perpetrator must be the brother or maybe the cousin of an individual for whom you have a DNA sample. is what's the level of appropriateness of that, and to what extent does that cause families to be dragged into criminal investigations in ways that violate their rights. Very much increasing opportunities there without clear guidance that I'm aware of. Now then, predictions. Taking a DNA sample from a criminal site, there are tests available, admittedly not with great accuracy, that claim to be able to predict the age of the individual based upon either looking at mitochondrial mutations or telomere length, or more commonly by looking at T cells to look at the amount of circular DNA, which tends to decrease over time. Now these are plus or minus maybe 9 years, but it still is an interesting new window that might actually be very attractive to law enforcement. And may I say, with many of these, part of the concern is whether these will be taken as more precise than they are. This will not be very precise, but it might be taken as such and therefore used to include or exclude suspects in ways that went outside the science. Certainly, ancestry predictions, which you can get, of course, direct to consumer as part of many different companies, which will make a reasonable estimate if all of your grandparents happen to come from one part of the world, about what part of the world that was. If you happen to be somebody with lots of different lineages, it gets a little more complicated, but still probably a fair, good opportunity here to make some sense about geographic ancestry. Again, great opportunities there, but also great risks, especially if this feeds into racial prejudices, which is an often possible thing to do. Just the same, this kind of ancestry prediction is now, I gather, being done in many criminal cases, hundreds of such cases documented by Pamela Sankar. 3 states actually outlaw this process. The Netherlands has actually a standard legal approach to use this. Belgium and Germany outlaw it, say you can't do it. So there's a lot of confusion here in states and countries about whether this is an appropriate use of DNA in forensics or not. So what's the right thing to do here? Predicting physical appearance. Certainly there are those who would say they're getting pretty good at predicting skin color and eye color based on a DNA sample. And there is a project called Visagen that aims to actually get good enough to be able to draw a likeness of the individual based upon increasing knowledge about genes and how they affect craniofacial anatomy. We're a long way from having that one yet, but when you consider identical twins generally look a lot alike, that probably tells you that we ultimately will figure out how DNA is involved in even such subtleties and be able to do a better job of that. Predicting recent travel. I mean, the Human Microbiome Project is underway now, which is an effort to characterize in a very detailed way what microbes are living on your skin or in your GI tract, and being able to do so without requiring that those be microbes you can culture in the laboratory. And undoubtedly, it will turn out that your GI microbiome says something about where you've been. Will that turn out to be important, just like, what particular dust is on your shoes and where that came from? Will your microbiome be part of the investigation to see whether you were there on the night of November 22nd or somewhere else? And then assessing presence of disease. If you have a DNA sample in somebody and you do a genome sequence and, oh my gosh, they've got hemophilia, that tells you, okay, I'm looking for a hemophiliac who committed this crime. And obviously that's easier to do if you're talking about a Mendelian condition where the DNA would be very strongly predictive. It would be much less useful in circumstances where you're simply making a guess about the likelihood of diabetes or the risk of somebody being a chain smoker. And then there's the other side of this coin is, could people now begin to use DNA information in the courts as a defense against criminal activities, as we learn increasingly some aspects of how DNA influences that. The study, for instance, out of New Zealand that showed that individuals who were both abused as children and had a particular DNA variant were much more likely to end up in trouble with the law than those who had only one of those 2 factors. So would such individuals be able to use that to ask the courts to let them off the hook, or at least to give a moderate sentence? Or would the courts say, oh no, you're probably the one we want to put away because you're predisposed to do this again? Again, there's a nice story about this whole issue of DNA and forensics in Science about a week ago. And I'm coming to the end. Let me just say a word, though, about neuroimaging, because I do think there's a lot of fascinating topics here, although as you're materials for the council point out, this is a field that is perhaps not as far along in terms of one's ability to anticipate what kinds of inferences can be made. Certainly the problem of incidental findings, though, is an enormous, obvious overlap with the genetic situation. MRI scans often give things you didn't expect, and often they're things you don't know what to do with. UBOs, as they're called, unidentified bright objects. Do you want to have one of those in your brain? Well, you might, and what are you going to do with that? Very difficult to say. And then getting again into forensics, lie detection, certainly there are those who believe this will become a more accurate means of assessing when somebody is practicing deception, and then other available methods. Personality prediction or profiling, again, something that might be used in making decisions about who gets access to which particular kinds of jobs or in the military, or also could be used in courts of law. Neuromarketing, a little scary concept there, trying to assess when people are responding effectively to certain kinds of advertising or branding, or even who's got the brain that's going to be most susceptible to a particular kind of manipulation. The fascinating area of exploring spirituality and what happens in a PET scan or an fMRI scan when someone is having a transcendental experience, and what does that mean in a philosophical way about what those experiences are all about. More here, I think, of a philosophical, theological set of questions than perhaps a forensic one. The utilization of this kind of neuroimaging to perhaps set a new standard for whether somebody in a coma is going to be able to recover or not. Obviously, a topic of enormous interest where we all recognize that our best methods are not always absolutely perfect in making those predictions. And of course, prediction of future disease risk, especially if you combine it with genetics. And here's a place where the two would intersect, where, for instance, the ability to look, as was recently published in a JAMA article, at the deposition of beta amyloid using a particular PET scan, in combination perhaps with ApoE testing, might give you a very precise statement about somebody's likelihood of developing Alzheimer's when they are still entirely without symptoms. And what do you want to do with that information? It might be extremely valuable for interventions if you want to start your clinical trial on people who have minimal disease. But of course, having that particular information provided to you, if it turns out that clinical trial isn't available or isn't going to work, could be obviously quite devastating. So I'll just conclude with this quote from Albert Schweitzer, which I'm very fond of, because certainly for me, somebody who had the privilege of leading the Genome Project, technology has been such an enormous advance for us in terms of our ability to understand how life works and how sometimes disease occurs. But we have to keep in mind that that's not really the goal. The goal here is to benefit humanity. We must not allow our technology to exceed our humanity. Thanks very much. I'd be glad to answer your question.
Thank you very much. And thank you. Yes, we can give thanks. What I'd like to do is just very quickly go around and have the commission members just introduce themselves, and then I'm going to open it up to a few questions.
Yes.
Barbara, would you begin? Put your mic on.
Thanks. Barbara Atkinson from the University of Kansas Medical Center.
Nelson Michael from the Walter Reed Army Institute of Research.
Christine Grady from the Department of Bioethics at the Clinical Center, NIH.
John Aris from a place you might know something about, University of Virginia.
Lonnie Ali.
Jim Wagner from Emory.
Raju Kushalapati, Harvard Medical School.
Nita Farahani from Vanderbilt University.
Steve Hauser, UC San Francisco.
Anita Allen, University of Pennsylvania.
Alex Garza, Department of Homeland Security.
And Dan Solmesi, the University of Chicago.
Great. Francis, let me just begin, just ask you a question based on an article in Lancet, and this is about the challenges in the clinical application of whole genome sequencing, but it's expansive, and I think it would be really interesting to me and other commission members to know what your take on this is. And it just says, in the view of the predicted frequency of recessive mutations in the population, every patient will learn that he or she is a heterozygous carrier of more than one serious or lethal autosomal recessive disease. And this is the consequence of whole genome sequencing if we, as you have done and as some members of the commission have done, have their genome sequenced. Now, it's one thing when Dr. Francis Collins learns the results and finds out, and I'm not going to ask you, to tell us what you found out, because we also have, as one of our ethical issues, the retention of privacy. But it's one thing when you find out, and you can get on the phone or have a meeting with any doctor you wish or any expert you wish. What do you think are the potential consequences of the ability to, in the market, get the results for the average person who might be curious about this?
So, yeah, this will be an important aspect of this broad application of whole genome sequencing. I haven't had my whole genome done, but I did have the 23andMe and the Navigenics and the DecodeMe analysis. And in one of those, they included carrier testing for a few of the common recessives. So I know, I will disclose, because it's in my book on personalized medicine, I'm a carrier for alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency. A condition which I would like not to have, and which, since I'm a heterozygote, I don't expect will affect me, especially because I'm not a smoker. I think the challenge will be, first, for people to recognize that this information says that there are no perfect DNA specimens, and that will be a come down for people who imagine that they're the one. But I think people will kind of get used to that. And there will be this list, and it will not only be for things like alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency, where we know something about what the homozygous state leads to, but it will also be, well, you've got a stop codon in a gene for which we have no information. That means you're a carrier, but I don't know what that means. You'll sort of be left with that lack of knowledge. Where the real challenge will lie is the increasing likelihood that individuals will obtain this information prior to childbearing. And they will want to know with their mate, okay, here's my list. Are any of the things on your list the same as mine? In which case, we then have a chance of a child, 1 out of 4, who will be homozygous for a deficiency of this gene. And again, that will become extremely challenging when the list matches, but the genes that match are not ones that we know anything about. How do you counsel a couple about their 1 in 4 chance of having null function of a gene whose function is not known, because these will be generally rare. Now, one thing that will help us there is having as many complete genomes on people who are already adults, so that one could see, are there in fact homozygous nulls in the population who seem to be doing fine, but often you won't have that luxury if it happens to be a rare event. So there's an enormous educational challenge here of healthcare providers and of the public. And I don't think we can count on the roughly 1,500 genetic counselors to be able to handle the volume that is going to come out of this. So this is a looming potential problem. It's also an opportunity. I might say one of the things that I think has not turned out so well as far as the way in which we do prenatal counseling is that it generally appears after a pregnancy has already gotten underway. And many couples really would have liked to have had the information about their risk for cystic fibrosis or Tay-Sachs disease, or a long list now of recessive diseases prior to conception. And in Tay-Sachs that is possible. In CF it's generally not. So if we get to this point of being able to give more couples that information sooner, that inherently should be a good thing, even though it presents all kinds of counseling and decisional problems.
Thank you. Jim?
Thank you so much for your presentation and the perspective you bring on both of these. I just had I'd like to probe you a little further on these 2 sets of ethical issues. Francis, one for neuroimaging and one for genetics. You pointed out a little bit of overlap between the two. In neuroimaging, you said, of course, the incidental findings would be an area of an overlap. You also mentioned that prediction of future disease risk would be something we'd find common to both technologies. You didn't imagine, however, that personality prediction might be. And I wonder also if another category that you just started to touch on, the age issue, children, the impact of, and the ethics of, well, you just mentioned preconceptual and prenatal counseling, but in the genetic side, but also the issue of early imaging of children and the question, the degree to which those sorts of findings might become self-fulfilling prophecies. What I'm really looking for, do you see a lot of overlap between these two with regard to genetic?
Well, I think you've just mentioned two important ones that I didn't touch on explicitly. Certainly behavior, the
Right.
ability of genetic factors to influence behavior, whether you're talking about depression or the ability to be a risk taker is an active area, and there probably will be some findings that hold up over time, although this is obviously a challenging one to be sure that you are able to replicate results. And similarly, a great area of interest in neuroimaging in terms of being able to make those predictions about who is more impulsive. And you rightly bring up the issue about early testing of children prior to the age of majority, which in general in genetics we have discouraged unless there is an action required. We would like to preserve for individuals the opportunity not to know if that would be their decision once they became adults. And I suspect many of those same arguments would play out in neuroimaging unless, again, there was a reason that the information could be valuable in terms of improving the outcome for that child. So I grant you, yeah, those two also fit. But I do think you're going to have an interesting time trying to figure out whether all these points of contact are sufficient to allow you to take on both of these areas, which inherently have intense complexities unto themselves.
Yeah. John?
I want to follow up on Amy Gutman's question. It seems to me that there's a conflict of values here with regard to access to all this genetic information by people out there in the marketplace. So on the one hand, it seems to me that experts, the more expert you get, often the more wary you are of information being given to people. In my experience, experts in genetics don't believe that more information is always better. And on the other hand, you've got this sort of free market libertarian sensibility that it's my body, it's my stuff, and I should have access to it, right? So you talked about the need for education, and I'm just sort of wondering, without knowing a whole lot about this, whether there's room for regulation as well. I mean, like, what do we do with all this information that's floating around out there, a lot of which may be useless or even harmful?
Well, yeah, it's something we all worry about a lot and should. Certainly, what one would not want to have are direct-to-consumer efforts that market genetic tests that are actually scientifically invalid. At a minimum, the test ought to have been proven to be clinically valid, that it actually makes a prediction, even a weak one, for which there is unquestioned scientific evidence. And in that regard, if there are such efforts out there that are actually taking consumers' money and giving them information that is incorrect, that's a bad thing. And regulation sort of rears its head at that point. The FDA, after considering this whole question about laboratory-based so-called homebrew genetic tests for a decade, is now engaged in moving in on this in a more active way. One role that NIH has taken on is the establishment of a genetic testing registry, which will be up and going by next fall, and which will be voluntary, but which will encourage responsible companies to deposit in a standard format the information about a genetic test that they offer, including what is the scientific evidence that this test actually makes a prediction that's clinically validated. That, I think, will be a useful clearinghouse put together in a form that is user-friendly for consumers to be able to go through it, so at least you can find out, what's the foundation of a particular claim before you decide whether to sign up or not. My own personal view is that it's hard to take a stance of being paternalistic here and saying, they're there, it would be bad for you to have this information about yourself because I, the scientist or the physician, have decided that it's just not something you can handle. That doesn't quite feel right. But I do think we have responsibility as a society, and the government is a part of that, to make sure that information is not being offered to people that's actually bogus, just as we do in other ways. And that would be, I think, a more light touch way to approach the whole question of regulation, but a touch that is needed. Ultimately, You know, there was a paper in the New England Journal, what was it, a month ago, from Eric Topol and colleagues asking the question, what happens to people who've gone through already this early stage of having their DNA analyzed? Do they all freak out? And the answer didn't seem to be no. In fact, it had very little effect. We're running a study at Henry Ford of thousands of people who are given predictive information. And it's actually been pretty reassuring that it looks as if people do understand that this is not yes, no. This is statistical up or down kind of risk factors. And they retain it reasonably well. Some of them act upon it in terms of health behaviors, others don't. But it didn't seem as if we were starting some sort of psychological disaster scenario, which some people had worried about.
Yeah, no, it's reassuring to see that evidence. We're actually over time, but I wanted to go into the audience and see if there's somebody who would like to ask Dr. Collins a question. Anybody? If not, I'm going to ask Nita to ask the last question.
So I wanted to focus on the area that you thought was the most salient one to take up now, which is the issue of forensic collection. So I'll pull it closer. And in particular, you identified two things. One is that there's a difference potentially between identification uses of this technology and prediction uses.
Yes.
And the extent to which you think that that's actually something that is feasible to do to really maintain a strong distinction between the two for technological purposes. And second, you mentioned but don't really focus very much on the overlap between the collection of neurological and genetic information for forensic use. And of course, both are being used quite extensively in the court system, and both of them have significant investigative potential. So I was hoping you could speak to the extent to which you actually think they overlap or really need to be treated as distinct concepts.
So in terms of distinguishing identification potential and prediction potential, it does get a little blurry. I mean, is predicting age, is that identification or is that prediction? It sort of seems like it's on the border there somewhere. And of course, the identification issues, as I try to point out, themselves are complicated when you start drawing in family members as your hook to get at the potential perpetrator. In terms of the way in which the courts are utilizing this information, both in neuroimaging and in DNA analysis, I think it's still early days to see how those are going to fit together. And certainly the neuroimaging part of that, in my view, and again, you'll probably hear from others who are better informed about this during the course of today, is still pretty exploratory in terms of what the actual value of that information is in trying to assess responsibility for actions and whether or not that ought to be part of the process of a legal proceeding or not. I think we have to be very careful that we don't over-interpret what we can learn from these particular kinds of analyses, be they genetic or imaging-based, and use that information to deny what is a cardinal principle in humanity, namely personal responsibility for your actions. There are, after all, in this room, roughly half the people have a 16-fold higher likelihood of ending up in trouble with the law than the other half. Those are the males. And yet we don't, I think, have people in a court of law saying, I shouldn't really be put in jail for robbing the 7-Eleven because my Y chromosome made me do it. Whatever we learn about criminality potential from other kinds of genetic information or imaging information will in general be a much weaker effect than the Y chromosome. And if we've learned that the Y chromosome is not an excuse for criminal behavior, then we certainly shouldn't take other factors that are probably less connected and elevate them to that status.
On that note, which I think is a very, very good for us to keep in mind moving forward, I want to thank you, Francis, and you got us off to a great start. Thanks very much.
Thank you. It's great to be here.